It is definitely wedding season, so we are going to talk about prenups, maybe the unsexy side of weddings, but they are becoming more and more popular, especially among millennials. So what are some things that you might need to know before you sign or consider having a prenup with your future spouse? We're going to get into it right now with our guest, who's an associate lawyer for Shulman Partners LLP, Laura Paris. Laura, thanks so much for making the time.
Hi, Chelsea. Thanks for having me.
This is really interesting that this is becoming more and more common. Is this just anecdotal, or are we seeing evidence that millennials are leaning more and more towards prenups?
Yeah, I think if I could probably make my best guess on why we're seeing that millennials are more interested in speaking about what we actually call marriage contracts in Canada, or prenups, is for two reasons. One, I think people are getting married later in life, meaning that they have a lot more to protect when they're walking into a relationship. And the second piece of it is that things are very expensive. So it's not uncommon that people are leaning on families and generational wealth in order to start their lives. And it may not actually be the millennial themselves that's pushing the conversation on the marriage contract, but actually their family who's funding, whatever future this couple is going to have.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for so long prenups were sort of, this idea of having a prenup was kind of just expecting that divorce was going to happen and preparing for divorce. And now I think we've sort of reframed our expectation of what a prenup really is for. I mean, it's ultimately just meant to protect you, and you hope that you don't need to lean on it, but it's really there just to give you a little bit of support.
Exactly. The way that I like to describe it is it's like an insurance policy. We don't get car insurance or health insurance because we want to get into an accident or we want something to happen to our home, but it's just in case. And a prenup should be looked at in the exact same way. It's just in case. And the reality is that divorces can be really messy. And having these conversations at a time when two people still care about each other and are civil with each other, while it may cost them money at the beginning, and it may cause some hurt feelings at the beginning, I think that it really is an important conversation to have, and it could save you lots and lots of headaches in the long run, in the event, unfortunately, the relationship doesn't work out.
What does the process look like for instating a prenup? I mean, should you be starting this pretty well ahead of your actual wedding?
I always say that, don't start negotiations less than a year or 6 months, pushing it before a wedding. And the main reason is that what you don't want to happen is that at the time, a marriage contract becomes relevant, someone disputes the validity of it on the basis that they signed because they felt they had no other choice. So the closer you get to the date of the marriage, the more likely, or more vulnerable, I should say, you are to that type of argument being made to say that someone's questioning the validity of the agreement on the basis that they signed under duress and didn't feel that they had another choice but to sign because their marriage was on the line if they didn't. And that's a reason to see these contracts being set aside. So if you want, the contract to have some teeth to it and to actually, stand the test of time, having those conversations early on and, well before the marriage date is definitely advisable.
So what's step one if a couple is thinking that they want to have a prenup before they get married? Is it to each find separate lawyers and then you draw up an agreement and negotiate? Or do you find one lawyer and you start working together with one? How does this work?
I would say that actually the first step in dealing with this would actually have a conversation between the two spouses and have an understanding of what, generally what you want the contract to look like. At that point, definitely once you've come to more or less a mutual agreement, consulting your own lawyers on this and understanding what rights or obligations you might be giving up or opening yourself up to. One big piece or important piece of marriage contracts is having financial transparency. Especially when we're dealing with somebody who is looking to protect a significant amount of assets that would otherwise be divisible under provincial legislation, you want to make sure that there's full transparency on what the individual is giving up, so that, again, another potential basis for challenging an agreement is is stating that you didn't understand what you were signing if you didn't have a full understanding of what that person's wealth was and what you were letting go of. So, we often, there are people who do choose to proceed forward with these types of agreements without financial disclosure. It's certainly not something that we recommend or stand behind because it does make the agreement quite vulnerable. So once the finances have been kind of put forward, then that's really the point where you start to see negotiations take place. And again, you want to try to have as much of these conversations amongst yourselves rather than through your lawyers, because if you have your lawyer having these conversations for you, you're paying for it.
Right.
So as much as you can agree to beforehand, the best is in your best interest, right? To kind of lower your fees, and also, you don't want lawyers fighting over these terms. You want to kind of come to that consensus beforehand. But yes, definitely you need your own separate counsel. You do need to get your own legal advice. There will be a period of going back and forth on certain language and things like that to make sure that each side position is being put forward in the appropriate manner. And then it's just a matter of getting it signed well in like a fair amount of time in advance of the actual wedding date, so you don't end up in a situation where, again, somebody says that they're signing under duress.
So have as many of those conversations as you can without your lawyer. That's coming from a very honest and kind lawyer herself that we're speaking to. Laura, I'm wondering if someone is coming into a marriage without a lot of finances, without a lot of assets, is a prenup still something that's worthwhile for them to pursue?
Not necessarily. I think that if you don't really have anything that you're bringing into the marriage, or that, maybe if there's an expectation that you might be receiving an inheritance of sorts, mind you, the provincial legislation, depending on what province you're in Ontario anyways, the provincial legislation does protect inherited property to an extent. But if you know that you have something big that's coming to you, you might just want to have an agreement that states that, just so that there's no questions about it at a later date in the event of commingling of funds or anything like that. But for the most part, prenups are for those who do have something that they want to protect. And it could even be, for example, let's say someone is studying to be a doctor and they recognize that down the line they're going to be making a significant amount of income, or perhaps opening a medical corporation. You could enter into a prenup to deal with your future wealth. Sure. And what you expect that to be. And, even in terms of spousal support clauses, limiting what your exposure may be once you do attain that greater level of income that you expect to attain. So, there could be a benefit in some circumstances in having a conversation with a lawyer before you have the conversation with your spouse, just to understand what the law is, because there's a lot of misconception on what the law is when you are married and how assets are divided and things like that. So just having that preliminary conversation just to get that understanding before you approach your spouse with that conversation could be advisable as well. But if you already kind of know what you're looking at trying to protect, like I said, having that conversation with your spouse, being on the same page with them before getting lawyers involved could also be a great tool to save you a little bit of money. Well,
Laura, this is so helpful considering that numbers are on the rise in terms of people pursuing a prenup before they get married. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Take care. That's Laura Paris, associate lawyer for Shulman Partners LLP. Prenups getting more and more popular among millennials, giving you some information on what you need to know before you sign it.